All right. Well, I'm pleased to have Brook Zscheil here today to talk about feral swine. While this is our closing presentation, it certainly doesn't indicate that this level of importance. And it's great that Brook was able to be here. I'm happy to report that as of today, there are no known feral swine in Washington State, and that's largely due to the efforts of Brook's organization. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for being here, Brook. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody for having me. Thanks Justin for the invite, and then Invasive Species Council for inviting us to come speak. So, I'm with USDA Wildlife Services. We're part of APHIS, which is Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, same as PPQ, one of the sister agencies. And here in Washington, we cover Washington and Alaska. I'm the Western District Supervisor over Western Washington. The state split in half with my cohort on the other side of the state, who actually does most of this work. So a little bit about Wildlife Services in case many of you don't know who we actually are or why we were tasked with managing feral swine on a national level. So we're actually a non-regulatory agency. We have no regulatory authority. And so we have to work within the confines of state regulations as well as other federal regulations. So it requires us to work, do a lot of cooperative outreach, working with other people, because we can't just come in under a regulatory authority and say that we're going to do any management actions. But this is how we got our authority. It was legislatively approved. We through the Animal Damage Control Act of March 2nd and the Rural Development Act. So we've been around for a long time, and our mission here is to provide federal leadership in the management of human-wildlife conflicts. So basically we come out and we assist people in managing wildlife damage, and that's damage that is caused or associated with wildlife on agriculture, human health and safety, natural resources, or property. So that's a large realm of work that we do. That includes all species of animals. So how do we do that? So it's kind of twofold. So first is technical assistance. So a lot of what we do is people have some sort of damage issue from any number of animal species, and we can provide them technical advice, advice on how they can prevent that damage or alleviate that damage, changing a practice of what they do, or doing habitat modifications or exclusions, anything to prevent or alleviate, because sometimes there's no way to actually completely solve that problem, but we try to reduce the damage that's occurring. And then if there's no way that we can actually do a non-lethal, as we say, a non-lethal technique that's going to alleviate the damage, sometimes we have to go in and actually remove animals, and that's done through various ways. We trap. We do a lot of different trapping techniques for different species of animals. So it all depends on what animal you're working with as to what traps we may or may not we may use. We have toxicants we can use, and also mainly this is done with another invasive species, the European starling, and it's DRC 1339. We have aerial hunting activities, or aerial gunning operations, which we do to protect livestock, and we do that with the removal of feral swine. And shooting, obviously, is a method. So just a quick thing, I'm here to talk about feral swine, but some other invasive species that we actually work with on this side of the state. Obviously, the European starling, horrible species, causes significant damage to agriculture. The big ball of birds you see all the time, especially in the wintertime. And nutria we also work with on this side of the state. However, with these species, we actually don't get federal funding, unlike feral swine, where we actually get federal funding to assist. So the other two species, the only management activities we can conduct are in cooperation with somebody who's actually requesting our services and providing funding. And that's how we work a lot of times as wildlife services. We don't get a huge allotment of federal dollars to conduct our operations. We actually rely on cooperative dollars, people who come requesting our assistance to give them some relief. So feral swine in Washington, we'll just kind of go through part of the national program of feral swine and what we've been doing over the last several years, and then get into Washington. And like Justin said, right now we're looking pretty good. We've never had a significant problem with feral swine in Washington State. We've had a few incursions, but those have all been managed, and currently we don't have any that we know of. So an outline, we'll go through the history of feral swine in the United States. They've been here for a very, very long time. The damages and risks caused by feral swine, strategy to manage these feral swine, the methods that we use to manage feral swine, and then any contact information and outreach if you do come in contact with someone that sees feral swine. So the history of feral swine, well, they've been here, you know, since the 1500s. They were brought by the explorers and the pioneers and the Spanish a lot through the South. They brought them as a food source. Swine were easy to keep alive. They could travel. And the best thing was if they knew they were going to return, they could actually let those feral swine stay there, knowing that when they came back, there would be pigs there for them to actually eat. So they would bring them and just turn them loose. And then they could return on their, you know, their adventures through the country, and they could have these feral swine there. So they've been there, and predominantly they were in the South. So feral swine don't necessarily move great distances. They're not moving by themselves through large parts of the country. Typically, they get into an area and they stay there. And so most of this is by human translocations. But you can see over the years, especially in the last just 10 years or 15 years, they've pretty much been found in every single state except a few of the Central West states. And it's not that they can't live there. Sometimes it's laws and other things that have prevented them from getting there, you know, since they're primarily moved by human means. So a lot of the reason we have these feral swine is human translocations, which was done for hunting purposes. So these animals are a big game species. They have really good meat. They're tasty. So they're attractive to hunters. And for the most part, they're unregulated in many states. They're not considered a game species, so they're not permitted. So they can be hunted all year round without permits. And that's attractive. So that they're brought there and released because when deer season's, you know, when the season's over, well, you have another animal that you can hunt and you don't have to buy permits. Escapes. So a lot of these states or several of the states had breeding facilities. So where you could actually breed feral swine or wild boar, and fencing feral pigs is not a good method. They root very easily and they can root under fence. They can actually jump small fence. So, you know, 4-foot cattle fence or something, they can jump, but they can root under any fence if it's, you know, not skirted. And then they've been bred. So some of these cases are where pigs have just escaped, and it's a domestic pig. They've escaped into the environment and they're never rounded up. And feral swine, or, you know, pigs in general, just so you're aware, about 3 generations is all it takes for a domestic pig that's in the wild, living on its own, to begin exhibiting feral qualities. So they grow hair, their tusks come back. But domestic pigs are very adaptable, as are, you know, feral swine. So it doesn't take them long. Even a domestic pig, once it's out, you know, it can survive. It doesn't need to be fed. It will find its own resources and survive. And they're prolific breeders. They're successful. They have few predators. They can begin to breed at about 6 to 8 months. A female, and they can have 4 to 12 piglets, and they can do that twice a year. So And that's pretty much everywhere. Even in cold climates, they can still produce 2 litters a year, although sometimes like in Michigan and in the Upper Peninsula, it's typically 1. But they can do it twice a year. And obviously in the southern states where it's warm enough, they're definitely having 2 litters a year. And once those piglets are about 4 months of age, they have very few predators. So coyotes can predate on young piglets when they're young, but at about 4 months, it's too big for a coyote unless it gets a good opportunistic chance. And then, there are mountain lions and bear can predate on them, but pigs are a challenge, especially since they do herd together and protect one another. It's not likely. So about 6 million feral swine in the nation, over 40 states or 41 states. So there's quite a few. And, Texas alone, they estimate about 1.5 million. Texas has a pretty big problem. But as you can see the spread with that map. So the Wildlife Services Field Operations component. So when we were mandated in 2015 to begin conducting large-scale feral swine management operations throughout the United States, 41 states were given allocations, and basically this is based upon the population numbers that were in that state and how widespread they were. So it broke it down into all these levels here. The dark red being the highest priority states. That means they have the largest number of feral swine and their distribution is wide. As you can see, Washington, that's a good thing being yellow. We're in a monitoring stage. So what we do is we monitor. So working with WDFW and other partners, if we get notifications that there was a feral swine spotted, or somebody calls in and said they think they saw a feral swine, we investigate that call. We call the people, talk to them, and then go out and obviously look for sign of feral swine. And if there is a confirmation, we go in and try to remove that. And so that's a process like we've heard all day long. If we get that, if it's on private property, things like that, we've got to go in and cooperate with the landowner to try to get in there and get permission to remove those animals. And so it's a lot of education and outreach to explain to these people the detriment that feral swine can cause. So there's a few states here that have actually been downgraded. So as we begin to remove feral swine, you will begin to get downgraded. So if you remove it to a level where either the populations that are known have been removed completely, or there's only a few sightings or low numbers, they'll actually start to downgrade those things. And the whole idea is eventually to get these states into level 1s or into monitoring stages. And especially the orange states that have fewer feral swine populations, that's obviously going to be an easier task than like Texas that has 1.5 million, estimated feral swine. So they've been labeled the world's worst invasive alien species. I'm not sure if that's true, but to give you an idea, it's estimated in the United States about $1.5 billion a year, and that's mainly to agriculture. A lot of damage they cause, like to natural resources. It's hard to estimate the damage they cause, but they cause a lot of damage to just natural resources, and that's to habitat as well as to other species of animals. So they will depredate on deer fawns, and they eat amphibians quite a bit. So frogs, salamanders, and ground nesting birds. So they're opportunistic. They're not necessarily a hunter, but they've got a big snout. And if they smell it or if they see it move, they will put it in their mouth. So the damage they cause is because of their behaviors. So their foraging behaviors, they're rooting around in the ground. Their head's like a big bulldozer is basically what it is. They shove that face down in the ground, like you hear about truffle, pigs finding truffles. It's the same thing. They put that snout right in the ground and they smell for anything they can eat, whether it's tubers, insects, uh, um, reptiles, amphibians, and then they just bulldoze their head through that ground to get there, and they'll dig deep. I've seen it in overnight up to my knee deep in rooting. So they can get down there if they really want to get down there. They trample things. Obviously, you can have large numbers of feral swine come into agricultural fields, and just that number, not only with the rooting, they're just going to trample everything down. And they'll do that to cornfields just to knock down the stalks to get to the corn anyway. They'll just go through pushing the stalks down to eat the ears of corn. And then wallowing can be an issue. So they can cause water quality issues by wallowing, which is rolling around. You know, they make mud pools so they can get mud on their skin to protect themselves from insects. And they'll do this in areas repeatedly. And you'll get large areas that just get destroyed from just wallowing. And, you know, obviously it's in sensitive riparian areas where they're doing this because it's typically next to some sort of water source. And then the damages to the resources, it can be anything: agriculture and livestock, natural resources, as I stated, property damage. You've got feral swine coming on just, you know, residential property, golf courses. And then it can be a human health and safety issue or pet issue, because these animals do get quite aggressive and they carry a number of diseases. So here's just some pictures of actual damage that they cause, and you can see even they do actually depredate lambs and calves. So pretty much any field crop they do damage to, whether it's peanuts, rice, corn, alfalfa, hay. They'll even go in and root around. It depends on what's there, and also if there's other sources of food, whether it's tubers, insects, larvae in the ground. They consume and contaminate crops and water sources. So I think everybody's heard of, like, you know, the E. coli outbreaks that have occurred in California on spinach and things like that. So some of those initial occurrences were contributed to feral swine from E. coli in their feces. They were contaminating the water that was actually being used to irrigate those fields. They prey on livestock, and like I said, they actually prey on wildlife species, so typically deer fawns. And they transmit disease to livestock, and the biggest disease that the veterinary services, another sister agency of APHIS, is worried about are foreign animal diseases like foot and mouth disease, African swine fever. And then they damage other things, farm equipment. They damage irrigation lines, getting into water sources, especially in your more arid areas. If there's irrigation lines that actually have water running through them, they can actually break those apart to get to the water. They can actually root up levee system, like levees, so it weakens the levee and, you know, fear of breaching. I've seen where they root up the side of roads, which causes erosion and then causes, you know, the road to actually slough off. So they can damage even significant road systems. So like I said, they carry about 30 diseases and parasites that are zoonotic. So they can transmit either to livestock or even to people, things like leptospirosis, plague. They compete with natural wildlife. So they're out there eating the same food sources that all our other native wildlife species are eating. And not only are they eating it, but they're damaging the habitat. And also that damage can actually promote the growth of invasive plant species because of the disturbance that they cause going through their rooting behavior. They contaminate water sources, increase levels of nutrients, lowered pHs, and then transmit diseases like E. coli, Giardia. It can also be a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And just an idea of Washington State, our resources over there that we have, that's a potential loss if feral swine would get in there, you know, get into an orchard, a grape field, anything like that. Those are the estimated values of losses that would occur by having feral swine. And then damage to property. So you see this a lot in areas where you have a lot of feral swine, because they'll get into just a neighborhood, and in one night, like that house picture, that's a night of damage. So somebody just comes out in the morning and they're like, okay, what just happened to my front yard? Well, a bunch of feral swine came through, and it'll be not just that house, but it'll be like 10 houses in a row, just all rooted up. And that goes for anything. Cemeteries, national monuments have had that happen, where, you know, in one night it's significant damage. It's acres of damage. So it's not just like, oh, I see some rooting. You just come out and like, what? So it's a significant problem to property damage. And then the national strategy to manage feral swine. So in 2004, we set up maps, started documenting where we had populations. This was either known populations, or we began to get reports like we are getting from WDFW, and we'd go out and investigate and say, sure enough, we have feral swine in this area. And so we began to just build this map and document where we had feral swine. And then we go in and start making a strategy to actually manage those feral swine. And like I said, since we're not regulatory, we have to work within the bounds of every other regulatory agency. So we begin to work with BLM, other land management agencies. We always have to work with the state game agencies, because, you know, keep in mind that many of these states have different laws about feral swine. So some states treat them as a game species. Some states like Texas treat them as a pest species, so they can be removed, hunted at any point in time. In other states, when I worked in Utah, we urged the state to actually make hunting or removal of feral swine by anybody illegal, except for the state or the federal government. And the reason that is a good thing is because if you can just go out there, if they're a pest species and anybody can remove them at any time, that encourages a translocation. It encourages somebody to say, hey, this is an animal that anytime I see it, I can actually shoot it and keep the meat. And so that encourages somebody to say, let's go get some pigs so I can let them go. Huh? It is, but it also encourages people to say, hey, let's get them here. And then they bring them. So, and there's a lot of impact. Sometimes they let domestic pigs go, and then they'll just get one like feral swine boar, and they'll let it go with those domestic pigs so they can begin to breed. Sure. So usually, you know, the damage is significant enough, but yeah, we fight that battle every day, especially with the nature of our work anyway. It's a problem, but yeah, absolutely. So in Washington, we have a good thing. Feral swine are prohibited to enter the state. So you can't bring them in to breed them. You can't bring them in to show. And they're deleterious exotic wildlife. So the good thing is people aren't going to be bringing in feral swine to either show or breed. So we've got the things in place, and I think it's important. Like the main strategy of our program is kind of a six-pronged approach. We first set up these strategic plans, obviously with all the cooperating agencies, and then we get a task force or a working group together and begin to build on these, because then a lot of times it takes legislative inclusion to pass laws to allow for these feral swine not to be introduced into the state. And then communication outreach, we've heard this, it's a common theme of the day, is just getting out there, telling people what these animals do, the damage they cause, and what they can do about it. So we have all these pamphlets, signs of reporting feral swine, and that's typically how we get it, is somebody reports to this 1-800 number, and then it goes to Justin, and then Justin gets it to us, where we can actually go out and investigate and make a determination if there's actually feral swine present, or if it's somebody's, the neighbor's pig got out and was running in somebody's yard. And then we can formalize a management strategy. Is it time? So this is how we do it. We set up cameras in areas you think you have pigs. It's a pretty simple process. And you wait until you get pictures and you know they're pigs. Obviously, you're going to see the signs of them anyway. And those are our management strategies. That's how we catch them. So we trap them in large corral traps. Judas pig operations, you actually put a collar on a pig and let it go. And it's a tracking collar. And we can actually track where those pigs are going. Since they group up, we can actually monitor where those groups of pigs are going. And then we can use that pig to track down the others to either trap them or shoot them. Aerial operations, we go up in helicopter, fixed wing, and we actually shoot the pigs from the aircraft. And night shooting, so we use a lot of thermal equipment to go out at night because pigs are smart. They become nocturnal very quickly, especially if you're doing daytime removal operations. So you can go out at night in complete darkness with thermal equipment and remove the pigs that way. And there's where all the pigs in Washington are that we've either gone out on a report, and then the ones where you see the numbers are actually where we've actually removed pigs. So most of them are on the east side of the state, but we do get reports on this side. But they've removed a handful here or there, a lot out by the potholes area. All right, well, thank you. I guess I'm out of time for questions, but
great. So there's stickers with the squealing pigs phone line. I always like to recommend that you take that and enter that